All right, thank you everybody for joining us this evening for Schoharie Crossings History at Home lecture series for 2026. This evening we have a wonderful presentation. We have a wonderful presenter. Tim Roth is the vice president now of the Canal Society of New Jersey. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You might be president?
No, I'm still vice president.
Vice president. Thank you very much. He's going to share some history about the Morris Canal from its inception in the 1820s to the abandonment of it about 100 years later. We're going to learn about the technology, the navigation, and what life was like for the people who lived and worked along the canal. Roth has a business and systems professional for 30 years, and he now likes to lend that analytical and communication experience from his professional life into the sharing and the passion, the history of canals in New Jersey. So please welcome Tim Roth.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone who joined in today. Before we start, let me just talk briefly about how our two organizations came together. I started these lecture series back in 2019 and started off doing them in person, and I just was getting used to talking to a live audience when COVID hit and everything went virtual. We started doing virtual everything, and we're all locked down at home. So we started reaching out to other canal organizations up and down the East Coast and saying, hey, let's do a quid pro quo here. I'll do a talk for your organization. You do a talk for our organization. And so that's how the Canal Society and the Schoharie Crossing hooked up. And David did a very excellent presentation for the Canal Society. Now, if you missed it, and for those Canal Society folks who were really interested, what is this Schoharie Crossing? We have all our program meetings on our YouTube channel. So go to YouTube, Canal Society New Jersey, and it was the May 21st, 2021 meeting where Dave gave the talk on Schoharie Crossing. So encourage you to do that. Another one we had on the Erie Canal more in general was a gentleman named Derek Pratt, who his presentation was on November 20th, 2020, and that was on the Erie Canal in general. So for the New Jersey folks here, they'll learn more about the Erie Canal, the New York canals, as the New York folks are learning about New Jersey canals tonight. Now, for my program tonight, for any of the New Jersey folks, if you know someone who missed this, would like to see it, they can watch it on the recording, as Dave mentioned. But I will be giving an in-person lecture of this same lecture, the same talk, on Sunday, March 8th, 2 p.m. at the Kinnelon Historical Museum. So that's if you want to see this talk in person or know someone who would like to, then that's how you can do it. Okay, let's dig into the story of the Morris Canal. The story starts way back 1822, more than 200 years ago, and it starts with a gentleman named George McCullough. Now, a lot of New Jersey people are probably familiar with him. He was a very wealthy businessman in New Jersey, big mansion in Morristown, New Jersey, big mansion, McCullough Hall. And legend has it that in 1822, he was fishing on Lake Hopatcong, New Jersey's largest lake, and he struck on the idea of using the headwaters of the lake to build a canal across northern New Jersey. Now, we don't know exactly if this legend is true or not, but we know the reasons why we needed a canal across northern New Jersey. And if we look at this verbatim quote from Mr. McCullough, it says, "The mouth of the Musconetcong is close to inexhaustible mines of coal, which could be afforded in New York so cheap as to exclude not only Liverpool coal, but also wood, which grows daily dearer. And for this reason, it would be used instead of any other fuel in distilleries, manufacturers, steamboats, etc." So to translate that a little bit, what he's saying is 200 years ago, we had kind of hit an energy crisis in northern New Jersey. All the big wooded areas that we have throughout northern New Jersey were all open fields because wood had been depleted and it was becoming very rare. It would be very rare to see trees. And that was because we used wood not only to heat our homes back then, but for iron furnaces. And back in the early 19th century, the iron industry in New Jersey, North Jersey, was booming. In fact, those who are local know that we had a big sinkhole in Route 80 last year. That was a collapsed iron mine. There are iron mines all over northern New Jersey. Well, when you mine the iron ore, you then have to smelt it using a big furnace, and that furnace uses a lot of fuel. So we were running out of wood and we had to find another fuel source. So what Mr. McCullough is saying in his quote is, well, we have three choices, basically. We either build a canal across the state of New Jersey to transport coal, which was out in Pennsylvania, not in New Jersey. We continue using wood, which is growing daily dear, meaning it's become depleted, or we use Liverpool coal. Now, where's Liverpool? That's in England. We know that from the Beatles. So he's talking about importing coal from Europe. What he doesn't mention as an alternative is bringing the coal in from Pennsylvania by road. And that's because transportation of large cargo by road was so inefficient, unfeasible. It was actually easier and more efficient to ship it 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean than it was to truck it 100 miles from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. Seems amazing today, but that was the truth. And that is what drove the creation of canals in the early 19th century. It was the best method for transporting large cargo back then. So the first question we're going to ask about this new canal is, who's going to finance it? Well, George McCullough wanted the state of New Jersey to finance it. He wanted to be publicly owned. The state of New Jersey wanted nothing to do with it. So his partners formed this private company, and it was called the Morris Canal and Banking Company. And they raised $2 million as stock, which actually paid for the initial building of the canal back in 1824. That's when it started anyway. Now that seems amazing. 2 million today wouldn't even pay for the plans for the canal, but that was enough for the initial construction of it. So it did successfully fund this canal. It also caused Mr. McCullough to disassociate himself with the whole project. Why? Well, he didn't like the idea of it being owned by a private enterprise. He didn't want speculators to own this canal. He did not want his name associated with a banking company because banks were suspected and mistrust by wealthy people back then. So even though George McCullough is considered the father of the Morris Canal, he was only associated the first few years, and then he had nothing to do with it. Financially, that was a very smart decision because while the canal was in existence for almost 100 years, it only made a profit for a few years in the 1860s. It was not a financial success at all. Now, second question is about water. Well, we kind of mentioned this. Now, people in New Jersey are familiar with Lake Hopatcong. It's the largest lake in New Jersey. And if you're familiar with it, the photo on the right or the image on the right is what you're most familiar with. Mother Nature didn't give us that lake. Mother Nature gave us what you see on the left, which is two much smaller bodies of water. A pond or a small lake called Musconetcong Pond, it was also known as Great Pond, and a much smaller body of water north of it called Little Pond. And there below Musconetcong Pond, you see what's called Brooklyn Ferry. That was the site of a forge. The area was called Brookland, and it would be eventually corrupted into Brooklyn, and that's why the area is known as Brooklyn today. Brooklyn Mountain, Brooklyn Stanhope Road, that comes from Brookland. So what they did was they placed a dam where Brooklyn Ferry is, and that raised the level of the pond greatly. It connected it to Little Pond, and it created the lake we see today on the right. Now, you may have heard Hopatcong is a Lenni Lenape word meaning either lake of many coves or honey water of many coves. Absolutely not true. It does not translate that way. And in fact, most of the coves you see in the lake did not exist when the native people were here. It was created because of the Morris Canal. Now, in addition to Lake Hopatcong, Lake Musconetcong, Cranberry Lake, Bear Pond, Greenwood Lake, which is on the border of New York and New Jersey, all are reservoirs for the Morris Canal. So need a lot of water to get across the state. So it was on November 4th, 1831, that the first trip was made on the canal. And at that point, the canal went from Phillipsburg on the Delaware River on the left part of your screen to Newark on the right part of your screen. Now, it would take another 5 years to extend the canal all the way to Jersey City, connecting the Delaware River to the Hudson River. Why 5 years? Jersey City is not that far from Newark. Well, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you see that big V there where the canal is. That's called an elbow, and that's a big elbow there. They had to, that elbow extends south all the way to the northern border of Bayonne. Why is that there? Well, the area is completely flat there. But if you're familiar with the Palisades Cliff, if you've ever been up the Hudson from New York City, you have these big towering cliffs on the west side of the river. That actually extends below ground south. It's called the Palisades Ledge, and it extends all the way to northern border of Bayonne. So as they're digging this canal, and they're digging it all by hand, shovels and picks, they hit that granite, and they had to find a way around it. And that's what created that big elbow between Newark and Jersey City. So in 1836, now the canal's connected Delaware to the Hudson. You can now transport coal from Pennsylvania to New York City and to the Hudson River. And below, you see all the counties and towns that the canal passed through. And the Morris Canal became part of the local canal system. There were two canals in New Jersey. The Morris went from Phillipsburg to Jersey City. In the middle of the state, the Delaware and Raritan went from Trenton to New Brunswick. Then we had the Schuylkill, which served Philadelphia. And we had the Lehigh Navigation Canal, which came from the eastern part of Pennsylvania. Now, you see on the Lehigh, there's a town called Mule-drawn there. That's what we know of today as Jim Thorpe. That was a big coal producer, a coal distribution area. So coal would come down from Mule-drawn. It would come down to Easton, and it would either cross the Delaware there and go across the Morris Canal to Newark, Paterson, Jersey City, New York City, or it would go down the Delaware division of the Pennsylvania Canal on the Pennsylvania side, and then cross the DNR from Trenton to New Brunswick. Now, one of our newsletters, we have a coal trip. It went from Mule-drawn to Elmira, New York. By car, that's about a 2.5-hour drive. By canal boat, that took a month. You have to come down the Lehigh to the Morris, go across the Morris Canal to the Hudson, up the Hudson to the Erie Canal, and down the Chemung Canal through New York to Binghamton, and then over to Elmira. So that was the slow transportation network of canals, but it was a whole highway system like it is today with roads. So some of the New York state folks who are on today may not be familiar with Northwest New Jersey, but it's very mountainous. It's called the New Jersey Highlands, and it's part of the Appalachian mountain chain that runs from Georgia up to Maine. And people may not associate New Jersey with Appalachia, but actually I live on top of an Appalachian mountain called Schooley's Mountain. So when George McCulloch back in 1822 envisioned this canal, he made a rough estimate, and his estimate was it would be an elevation change of about 300 feet going across the state. He was way off, in fact, way, way, way off. It was actually 1,674 feet. From the Hudson River to Lake Hopatcong, which is the summit, there was a 914 feet change in elevation. And then from there down to the Delaware River, it was 760 feet an elevation change. So the Morris Canal would have to be a mountain climbing canal. Now, to put this into perspective for the Erie Canal folks, here are the stats on the two canals compared. The Erie's 363 miles long. It had an elevation change of 565 feet. So if we take an average from that, you're about 1.5 foot average elevation change per mile. Morris Canal, 102 miles, 1,674 feet in elevation. You're talking average of more than 16 feet every mile, that elevation change. So that's a lot. This had never been done before. How are we going to solve this problem of this elevation change? Well, there are two methods used. The first method most people are familiar with, the Erie Canal people would be familiar with, is locks. Almost every canal has locks, and they're very simple. You have two walls, you have gates on each end. A boat comes in, you close the gates, you open up valves in the upper canal to let water in, raise boats up, or you open up valves in the lower canal to let water out and lower the boats in the lock. So there are a total of, in the Morris Canal, 34 locks. 23 of them were lift locks, 9 were guard locks, 2 were outlet locks. And the locks overcame elevations between 1 foot and 17 feet with the deepest ones. Now, here we have a couple of historic photos of Morris Canal locks. Now, I'm going to show a few historic photos tonight. If you want to see more historic photos on the Morris Canal, go to our website. We have an archive. You can search on any criteria, hundreds and hundreds of historic photos. But the top one is our favorite one. This shows a Morris Canal boat going through Lock 2 East and Ward. And this is the only completely restored lock on the Morris Canal. And you can see it's a very tight fit going there. And there, we see all the people doing what they would do when you lock through. The tender is open up the valve, letting water in. The boat's raising up. The captain has opened the mule feed box on the boat, because anytime you go through a lock, that's a great time to feed your mules. The mule driver is coming forward with the feed bag to get the mule feed. And look at those mules. You can see them there looking with much anticipation of getting their snack while they go through the lock. Then we have these two young ladies that obviously came from the store. They have their shopping bag and their basket and their jug. We don't know. They could be just passerbys, or they could be the daughters of canal boat captains who are about to get on the boat. Now, in the foreground, in the stern of the boat, you see the cabin. There's that white object there. That is a conch shell. All captains carried conch shells on their boat. I don't know if you can see me, but I'll blow the conch shell. That is how boaters alerted a lock tender that they were coming. They blew that about a half mile before, and if you were a tender and you heard that sound, you knew you had to get out and get that boat ready to come through. The lower photo is taken in Ledgewood. For those of you know who Ledgewood, it's completely different today. It's highways and strip malls and very busy. Back then it was rural. And that's a work scow going through. It's a much smaller boat. Work scows made their way up and down the canal and made repairs and so on. But that's just another lock photo of the 34 locks that are on the Morris Canal. So the locks, as I said, were good for 10, 15 feet in elevation. What happens if you had a much bigger elevation change? How are you going to handle that? Well, you can do this. This is called flights of locks, and it's where you stack locks up like steps. Now, those of you, the Erie Canal folks, you're familiar with this because you got Lockport. Lockport, New York, there was a flight of 5 locks. You can see that photo in the upper right. And in England, there's a much, much bigger flight lock. In the Kennet and Avon Canal, 29 locks, 237 feet in elevation. Wow. Well, this is a solution, but there is a little logistical problem with this solution, and that is time. Figure it takes you about 10 minutes on average to get through each lock. So in Lockport, it's going to take you about 50 minutes to get through this lock of 5. And Kennett-Navin Canal, it's going to take you 5 hours to get through this 29 locks. So with all the big elevation changes in the Morris Canal, this is going to cause a problem because it's going to add a lot of time to the trip across the state. So they really had to come up with a different solution for these big elevation changes. And that solution was this, inclined planes. Now, the Morris Canal was the first canal in the world to use inclined plane technology and the only one in the United States. And very simply put, you have a plain or a hill, you have railroad tracks on it, and you have a cradle with wheels on those tracks. You float the boat into the cradle and then use water power to pull the boat up and down the inclined plane. Now, if you look at the upper right, you see the original design of the inclined planes, which was a big water wheel. It's like a water wheel that you'd see in a mill or forge. And that worked well, but it only could handle boats that were about 20 tons fully loaded. It was okay for the first 10 years of the canal. Once we get into the 1840s, demand for cargo was greatly increasing. Why we'd entered the Industrial Revolution at that point. So what the Morris Canal Banking Company did is they hit the reset button. They sold a whole bunch of new stock. They enlarged the canal, they enlarged the locks, and they totally redesigned the inclined planes. So if you look in the middle of the screen, you see what the final design was. And it consisted of a large turbine. And you can see in the lower left, that's a surviving one. That's how big it is. That's me next to it. That was about 20 feet underground. And then water came from the upper canal down a big tube called a penstock. It would go underneath the turbine, spin it like a lawn sprinkler. That turned a large drum surrounded with cable. And the cable pulled the boat cradles up and down the inclined plane. Now, with the new design, the boats could carry 70 tons of coal or cargo total. So it could pull close to 100 tons total, including boat and cargo. Now, to do that, it needed very thick cable. The type of cable was Roebling cable. Roebling cable, the Roebling Company was in Trenton, New Jersey. Mr. Roebling, if he sounds familiar, he designed and built the Brooklyn Bridge. So if you ever drive over the Brooklyn Bridge and you see the cable holding up the suspension, that is the same cable that was used on the Morris Canal to pull these boats up and down the inclined planes. So there were 23 inclined planes on the Morris Canal. They overcame elevations between 33 and 98 feet. And if we do the math, they saved more than 18 hours in travel time as opposed to using flights of locks. So a couple historic photos here. The upper one shows a boat. It just floated into its cradle. It's starting to make its way up the plane. You can see the water line on the cradle. And the lower one is kind of a captain's point of view in the cradle looking down the plane. This is the Wharton plane, 5 East, looking down, and on the left you see the powerhouse. So that's where the big drum and the equipment is to get the water flowing and operating the inclined plane. Now, when inclined planes were built, they were considered an engineering marvel. And engineers came from all over the world to see them. So they were used in other parts of the country, Europe and Asia. And sadly, since the Morris Canal was abandoned, we don't have any functioning inclined planes in New Jersey anymore. But there is one in Poland. The Elblag Canal in Poland, they built inclined planes using the technology of the Morris Canal, and they still operate. So if you want to actually take a ride on an inclined plane, you'll book a trip to Poland, and you can actually take a boat up or down the inclined plane. The gentleman who is the head of this canal back in 2019, he made a pilgrimage to New Jersey. He went from one side of the state to the other because he wanted to see where the inclined plane started, visited all 23 sites and inclined planes, didn't speak a word of English, had the police called on him many times. Fortunately, he wasn't arrested. Did a very good program for us on El Blanc Canal. So that was really, really exciting. So we had 34 locks, 23 inclined planes, so 57 different places on the Morris Canal where you had a lock or plane that had to be tended. And they were tenders, lock and plane tenders, men and women who were employed to operate them. And they were paid very little, but they were provided a house to live in year round. So that was the good point. They had free housing. On the upper right, we see this is Lock 2 West in Mount Olive. All female run lock. Mr. Fluke, it was called, the Fluke family ran it. Mr. Fluke spent his day working on a work scow. He had a wife and 4 daughters. They were the ones who operated the lock. So what we see the Fluke daughter doing here is this is called a drop gate. It was the upper gate that closed, and when you lowered the water lever, the pressure kept it closed. Once you had equilibrium, you took just a little nudge to open it, and that's what she's doing there, is kind of giving a little nudge to open that drop gate. Now, a lot of the tender houses are either gone or they're private residences. There is one that's totally restored. This is Lock 2 East in Wharton. It's the only, it was just finished a couple years ago. The Canal Society, it was done by the Canal Society, didn't do it, the Borough of Wharton restored it, but we did furnish it. And if you're interested in seeing a tender's house, what it looked like, it was restored to a plan. Pathways of History, May 2nd, Saturday, come out and we will have it open to the public. Okay, now there were many places in the Morris Canal where it crossed rivers. So we talked about all the different reservoirs of water that fed the canal. Many rivers fed it, because it followed rivers all the way across the state. And it had to cross rivers in a number of places. How did it do that? Well, the first was to navigate across the river, which makes sense. It's a boat, but it's not as simple as you think. It's as you may think. There's 3 things you need to cross a river. You need a dam, because you have to create slack water. You need a bridge for the mule and the mules and the mule tender to get across, and you need a guard lock to control the water going into the canal. So both these photos are Waterloo Village. The boats just come down Alpha Plain 4 West. It's the boat is coming out of the cradle, and it's about to cross the Musconetcong River. And then the bottom photo shows the boat going in the other direction through the guard lock and then on its way down the canal. Now, those of you familiar with the Waterloo Village, the lower photo looks pretty much as it does today. We still have the canal store there. We still have the lock. Big difference over and left. That was wide. That's back then. It was wide open fields. Today, it's now thick woods, and that's kind of the testament to why the canal was needed, because we had far less trees back then, even though this is early 20th century, so the trees have grown back. But that's why we needed to transport the coal. Now, I mentioned earlier the boats, if they were coming from Pennsylvania, had to cross the Delaware River. How would they get across the Delaware River? That worked a little bit differently. You couldn't build a big dam and block out the Delaware. So they actually, the dams were used to stop the current, to dissipate the current. And the Delaware River, the current was used to get the boats across the river. So the way it was worked is they had a cable strung across the Delaware. They attached the boat to the cable, and by pointing the bow downstream, the current would carry the boat across the river. So in this illustration, we see Easton, Pennsylvania in the background. The boats come out of the Lehigh Navigation Canal. It's making its way across the river to Phillipsburg, and you got this little scow that's pushing on the stern, keeping the bow downstream to get it across. And the captain has the tiller, hard to port to, make the boat turn to starboard. So this is how it got across the Delaware. If it was going east into Phillipsburg on the Morris Canal or New Hope to Lambertville on the DNR Canal, this was the same method. Now, if the canal ran higher than the river, then we would use aqueducts. Now, Schoharie Crossing, folks, you're familiar with aqueducts because that's what the Schoharie Crossing was. And we can't compete with you there. Schoharie Aqueduct was over 600 feet long. We had nothing like that. The longest one we had on the Morris Canal was in Lincoln Park, 275 feet long. And you could see it up at the top. And then the biggest one overall was at Little Falls, and that was the Little Falls aqueduct over the Passaic River that you see in the lower photo. That was the largest man-made object on the Morris Canal. It was over 60 feet high and 80 feet long. Now, remember that image of the Little Falls aqueduct. So we're going to see that at the end of the presentation in kind of a different disposition. Now, I mentioned there were two canals in New Jersey, the Morris Canal going across in northern New Jersey, DNR going across central New Jersey. Now, the big difference between the two canals, they both transported cargo, but it was the vessels that were on the canal. The DNR had all kinds of different types of vessels. It had large schooners, large steamers, tugboats, Civil War ironclads. All these boats navigated the DNR Canal. So because of that, it was a much bigger canal. They had much bigger locks, deeper, and it was far more financially successful than the Morris Canal. It also lasted a lot longer. The Morris Canal was designed only for cargo traffic. So it was designed specifically for Morris Canal boats. And you can see what they look like here in the lower left. They were small boats. They were only 91 feet long. They were 10.5 feet wide, and they were in two hinge sections. Now, why were they hinged? Because of the inclined planes. As they went over the brow of the top of the plane, they had to be able to bend. So both the cradles and the boats were hinged. The hinge on a boat had to be lined up with the cradle, so when it went over, the keel wouldn't break. And all the locks in the inclined planes were designed just for that size boat. And that's why once the cargo traffic dried up, really the canal had very little use anymore. Now, in the DNR Canal, because of all the vessels, all the road bridges had to be able to open. So in the DNR, you had lock tenders and you had bridge tenders. Morris Canal, you had lock tenders and you had plain tenders. You didn't have bridge tenders because all the road bridges were purposely designed so they were humpback, meaning they were just high enough for all the boats that use the Morris Canal to scoot under them without having to open. So in the lower right, we see a bridge in Hackettstown. That's actually an inspection boat called the Katie Kellogg. This is what the Morris Canal Banking Company executives used to inspect the canal. And you can see all the boats were very low slung. They were made so they can go under the bridge. So we didn't need to have lift bridges. All the bridges were very simple wooden bridges. They were good for horses and carriages. They would not hold modern trucks and cars and so on. So that was one of the reasons that the canal was abandoned. Many, many, many bridges would have to be replaced with steel bridge to handle the vehicles that we have today. So this photo shows a really good illustration of how tight these boats fit in the lock. Locks were 95 feet by 11 feet wide, so you had 3 inches on each side. And it shows a good demo what the stern of the boat looked like. We had a tiller and rudder, so that's why we call it a boat, not a barge. It was navigated. The rope was attached so you could raise or lower the rudder depending on how far deep the boat was into the water. This boat is a empty or light boat, so it's sitting very high. You see the very small little 10 by 10 cabin where the canaler and his family lived. The rest of it was all cargo. And you see the water barrel there. The canalers bathed in the using the canal water and washed their clothes, but they couldn't drink it, so they had to have a barrel of potable water to drink. So good view of the stern of the boat in the canal. Oh, you see the number on the cabin, 769. That's how they kept track of the boats for tolls and cargo and so on. Every boat had a number. Every lock and plane tender had to record it coming through, and it was recorded when they entered the canal at Phillipsburg. Navigating, 2 people minimum, captain steer the boat, and a driver tender to keep the mules moving. Mule tender was usually a young man, 10 or 12 years old, was hired to go with the captain on a boat and live with him in a cabin and keep the mules walking. The canal ran 6 days a week, so you're talking about 20 miles a day, 6 days a week. A mule tender would walk. That's pretty strenuous. He'd be responsible for feeding the mules, for keeping them cleaned and watered. At the end of the day, taking the harness off and brushing them, getting them ready in the morning. You see behind the mule tender, there's stables built up and down the canal to hold the mules. I think in Erie Canal, you had much bigger boats. Mules were often kept on the boats. The Morris Canal boats were too small, so they never went on the boat. They were kept in stables there. Now, if a captain had kids, if he took his children along with him, they would serve as mule tenders, and they were sometimes sons, but they were also sometimes daughters. James Lee Sr., back in the 1970s, interviewed a lot of surviving people who lived and worked on the canal, and he interviewed these 2 women. They were both daughters of canal boat captains, and they both drove the mules. On the left, we see Mrs. Van Horn. She was a daughter of Captain James Campbell. She made the comment, canalers helped one another. They were good kind. They were poor people that had the boats, but they were good to each other. In a separate interview, Mrs. Mann, who was daughter of Peter Lindstrom, was talking about how one of their mules died on a trip, and she said, we borrowed off Mr. Jim Campbell. So her dad borrowed a mule off of Mrs. Van Horn's dad. And so that's kind of how the canalers all worked together and helped each other out. Now, interestingly, ancestors of these 2 women are still involved with the Morris Canal Greenway. So the 2 gentlemen you see lower bottom, James Lee III, Robert Twint, were great-great-grandsons, or are great-great-grandsons of the 2 canal captains we talked about. Peter Lindstrom, upper right, left, James Campbell, upper right. And I introduced these 2 gentlemen a couple of years ago. They hadn't met, and Jim meets Bob, and so the first thing he says to him is, yeah, I understand your family lent my family a mule at one time. So he's, passing along these, keeping these stories alive. And I think it's great that, we have descendants of the canal boat captains who were involved in the whole Morris Canal Greenway effort today. So another good photo just shows life on a canal boat. So the canalers were living on these small boats 9 months out of the year. Every month where we didn't have, as long as the canal wasn't frozen over, they'd be running the boats. And it shows a woman, she's at the hinges where you had the most deck space. She's cooking over an open stove. She's got laundry hanging out to dry. She's got a pot of water, her basket's there. The captain's in the back steering the boat. So, this is life on this canal boat. This is how they lived, every day, most of the year. And the boats would be running from very early in the morning to very late at night. So it was tough life. It wasn't easy. So the captain typically rented his boat from the Morris Canal and Banking Company. He had to make all the repairs and upkeeps on the boat. Lots of leakage. They're wood boats, there would be a lot of leaks. Fortunately, with inclined planes, you could use the cradle as a dry dock. If there was another boat waiting, you could ask the tender to pause the cradle, and you could fix a leak here. So we see in this photo, the mule tender is fixing a leak. The captain is kind of supervising them up on the bow, and they're giving the mules some their lunch while they're doing this. So everyone's kind of busy. And we've got the dog there; he's busy too. Captains, so the captains rented the boat, but they had to provide the mules. They had to own the mules. They cost about $150 for a team of mules. A lot of money back then. That was an exorbitant amount of money. So if you wanted to be a canal boat captain, you had to save up to buy your team of mules, and that was your major capital investment in being a canal man. You took great care of your mules because they were your bread and butter, and other captains would judge you by how well you kept your mules. So this is either a captain or a tender, proudly showing off his team of mules, and that's what pulled the boats. That was their motor, and you would feed them before you fed yourself. So you always made sure you had mule feed on the boat because they took the priority. They were like, gas for a trucker. Without gas, you're not going to go. All right, so give you a really, really high-level timeline in the Morris Canal. Opened in 1831, operated for about 10 years. 1840s, they had to hit the reset button, totally redesign it because of the increased demand. 1860s is when it hit its peak. Civil War had something to do with that. And then from 1870s on, it was a slow progression of the railroad taking over the canal business. So it wasn't a matter if, it was a matter of when. Now, what kept the Morris Canal going the last few decades is an agreement they had with Lehigh Valley Railroad, who leased out all the Morris Canal property, and that provided income for the Morris Canal Banking Company. Now, what the Lehigh Valley Railroad really wanted was the property up in the upper right, you see there. Now, if it doesn't look familiar, this is Liberty State Park. That was all owned by the Morris Canal Banking Company. Today it's a beautiful park. They got that beautifully restored train depot. You can take the boats out to Ellis and Liberty Island. Great place to visit. But back then, boy, what a valuable piece of land it was. It was right across from Lower Manhattan. Look at all the rail lines coming in. Look at all the ship docks there. So you could see why Lehigh Valley Railroad really wanted this land. So when the canal was abandoned, most of the canal went to the state. This went to Lehigh Valley Railroad. And there was about a 10, 15-year period where really we weren't transporting cargo anymore, but the canal was still there. How was it used? It was used recreationally. A lot of swimmers, a lot of paddlers. The photo in the lower right you see is a couple canoeists and a swimmer. That's in the Little Falls Aqueduct. And that was used in some cases to transport people. The boats on the lower left are transporting vacationers to Lake Hopatcong. This is the canal, the station by Lake Hopatcong. So passengers are coming in, they're going on to the steam launches and then up the canal and through the feeder to Lake Hopatcong. So it had some use in its last years, but not a lot. Now, we started this story with a man named George McCullough. We're ending it with a man named Hudson Maxim. They're both very wealthy individuals, very influential, very interesting gentlemen, even beyond their associated with the Morris Canal. Now, before I talk about Hudson Maxim and his involvement, if you're interested in learning more about either of these two gentlemen, the Canal Society did a program meeting last year, 2 program meetings, one for each of these folks. We had Ryan Hyman from the McCullough Hall Museum do one on George McCullough, and Marty McCain from the Lake Hopatcong Historic Museum do Hudson Maxim. Invite you to watch those. They're on YouTube. Really interesting gentlemen, a lot of history about them. But anyway, Hudson Maxim was a wealthy landowner, owned a lot of property on the west shore of Lake Hopatcong. Now, what happened during the 19th century? Beginning of the century, water was used mostly for industry. We used it for forges, for mills, so on. We used it for transportation, canals. 100 years later, beginning of the 20th century, we found better means for power. We found better means for transportation, but we fell in love with water recreation. The Jersey Shore, of course, was going crazy, but Lake Hopatcong was the biggest freshwater lake in New Jersey, and it became a big resort. So Hudson Maxim, he owned all this property, and he had great concern about the Morris Canal because during these fauna years, they were talking about what to do with the canal. And one of the um, choices or one of the possibilities was using it as a water source to feed water to the cities in the east. Now, if you're keeping the canal at a constant level, you only need to draw water to keep it at that level. If you're using it as a water source, you're constantly drawing water off the canal. Where's the water coming from? Lake Hopatcong. So his fear was he's going to see the waters of Lake Hopatcong just depleted. There would be no lake left. So Hudson Maxim was really the guy who led the abandonment of the canal. He wrote reports, he attended meetings, he had committees. He fought to get the Morris Canal abandoned. So Hudson Maxim kind of has this dual reputation. For the Lake Hopatcong folks, he's a hero. He saved the lake. There's statues for him and monuments and schools named after him. So on. For the Morris Canal enthusiasts, he's kind of the bad guy. He's the guy who killed the canal. So you kind of have these two extreme views of him, but he's very, very interesting historical gentleman. Very interested in dynamite, love to explode things. In the lower right, you see this was his boathouse. That's how wealthy, he had a big estate. When that started to fall to rack and ruin, he blew it up. Now, speaking of blowing things up, so the canal was abandoned in 1924. We just hit the 100th anniversary of the abandonment 2 years ago. One of the first things they did was blow up that little falls aqueduct. So remember that big aqueduct we saw the picture of? There it is getting blown up. And this photo is on the cover of a book that was just published a year or so ago, Robert Goller, Disappearing Act. Really great book about the abandonment canal. If you're interested in buying it, you can buy it at one of our program meetings or contact me. I can get a copy to you. But it was a great book. But yes, the canal was abandoned a little more than 100 years ago, and most of it is gone today. But we have the effort of the Morris Canal Greenway, which is a collaborative effort to, in some cases, bring it back to life, tell the story of it, interpret it, clear trails to make everyone understand where it was and what it did and so on. Part of what I'm doing tonight is part of the Morris Canal Greenway. And in some cases, restored. So what we see here is the restored lock at Wharton, one of the few totally restored assets of the Morris Canal, one of the longest watered stretches of canal. It's about a third of a mile long. Very few stretches of canal that actually have water in them. So Forest Park in Wharton, great place to visit amongst other canal sites. Now, if you want to see Morris Canal tours, especially for you New York folks, if you want to make a journey down to New Jersey when the weather gets nicer, our website, canalsocietyNJ.org, we have all kinds of trail brochures under Morris Canal, and I can tell you a lot of great places in New Jersey to visit where you can walk along the canal towpath or visit assets or see some just wonderful sights about the Morris Canal. And that is my presentation, folks. Here's my contact information if you want to send me email. Love receiving email. There's our website, all kinds of great stuff up there. We do Facebook if you want to follow us in Facebook, and I don't have it up here, but we do have the YouTube channel also, as I mentioned. So I'll turn it back to you, David, if there are questions that people have.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Excellent photos, excellent presentation. I was assuming that it would be based on the last time that we had a program from you. There's some questions. Feel free to drop those in the chat here if you're viewing us live through Teams. Um, so I'm just gonna kind of throw in. I made a few of my own little notes here, and the shell that the canal boat captains would use versus where we in New York, particularly for the Canal Society in New York, meetings are opened with the horn. Every boat had the boat horn, and you blow into it and make that loud noise. And we have an interpretive prop of one that makes great noise too. So that's always kind of interesting. The design, the engineering, just the I made a little note, particularly about at the hinges, which would probably make a really wonderful title if you were going to write a book about anything really. Just like living life at the hinges is pretty good.
Yeah.
Um, so and there's a few other things that I kind of I feel like there's these other connections. You did a great job of kind of talking about how there's differences and similarities between like the Erie for a lot of us here in New York, as well as the Morris and other canals in New Jersey. And shamelessly, there's other connections. Roebling, there was a Roebling design bridge near Schoharie Crossing. It wasn't a Roebling company, but it was a Roebling design. They kind of borrowed a lot of that design work. I put it in the chat too that you mentioned the Brooklyn Bridge. That stone came, a portion of it from Canajoharie, New York. It's an Erie Canal town. So that's fantastic as well. And the need for wood, I think, is interesting. And having only spent bits and pieces of time in New Jersey, that even goes back, and this is me kind of connecting that thread toward the American Revolution 250. New Jersey was a source of conflict over wood even during the American Revolution. So you have like those foraging wars that are happening in New Jersey, and well, come to find out that you still needed wood for fuel later on.
Oh yeah, yeah. It actually Northwest New Jersey, there's lots and lots of wooded areas. And I give presentations like one place, Jefferson Township, big forested area. And I went up there and I said, imagine this all being open fields. And people are like, really? It's like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
how it was 200 years ago.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine today, but yeah, wood was used for everything until we brought coal in.
Yeah, we have some great shots along the canal. There was a big federal survey of the Erie back in the 1930s. You compare those images to satellite images today. There is quite a sort of I wouldn't exactly call it reforestation, but you definitely that term pops in my head.
Oh,
We, as you're probably aware, along the Erie have our own little falls.
oh, really?
Um,
Yes. I was doing research and I came, yeah, Little Falls and Erie Canal. I said that would
yeah.
probably, yeah, might confuse people a bit. The other one too is Ephraim. I didn't mention him, but Ephraim Beach was the main engineer that designed the Morris Canal. He was involved with the Erie Canal also.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. New York was hemorrhaging newly ordained engineers at the conclusion of the Erie or during that process where all these guys became engineers and uh, suddenly were dispersed into other places to find um, their entrepreneurial and engineering skills needed in other places. So that's pretty fantastic. So there is a question that came through. I'm going to pose it. You kind of had addressed part of it, but came in as, was there any consideration not to shut down the canal, and why is the Erie Canal still navigable today?
I yes, there was effort to save the Morris Canal. I don't know enough about the Erie while that's still there. What I can tell you is the two canals in New Jersey, the Morris Canal, which is completely abandoned, and the DNR Canal, which is still totally watered. Well, the difference is the Morris Canal was abandoned because they didn't want to use it as a water source. The DNR Canal is still there because it is being used as a water source, the DNR Water Company. So it was all about the use of water, but the difference is the DNR is fed from the Delaware River, which really there's a endless supply of water. the Morris Canal was being fed by, its main source, Lake Hopatcong, where there's a finite source of water, and um, it was too important at that point as a resort that the pressure to abandon it, was too great. And I can tell you, Lake Hopatcong people, if it was, there's currently a dam that feeds the Musconetcong River, which is a 45-mile river that goes to Delaware uh, River. If it was up to them, they would close off the dam and dry up the Musconetcong River. And I have to remind them and say, don't forget, Lake Hopatcong is only 200 years old. The Musconetcong River is 12,000 years old, so it takes precedent. But, it's all about the water, the demand for water and where it's going to be used and where the precedent, the priority is.
Right. And so I'll venture at least a short version of an answer for why the Erie Canal is still navigable today. The maybe one of the biggest reasons would be that in New York State's state constitution, the canal is protected. That the canal is to be operable, and unless it gets taken out of the state constitution, the state has an obligation for the people of New York State to maintain and operate that navigation in today's modern canal. The slightly longer add-on to that would be that there's the last iteration, creating of the barge canal system, also has other functions when it comes to flood mitigation and irrigation, and there's been a big push since the 1950s in particular and into the 1960s toward using it as a form of conservation, but also recreation. So the canal does carry cargo today here in New York on the Erie, but it is much more of a recreation way. So that's why there's still navigation on the Erie. So there's also a question here on how folks could get a copy of the book Disappearing Act.
Send me an email, and I'll work it. Now, if you don't have my email address, our website has a contact form. The contact form will come to my email. So whether you use your contact form or send it directly in my email, I'll get it.
Right.
I'll make arrangements.
Nice. And then there's another question about if there's any timeline on Plane 9 West museum tours, those things starting up again.
All right, Plane 9 West is very what happened with Plane 9 West is we used to have tours once a month, April through October, and there was a bridge that you crossed and you went up a driveway up to the top of the plane where there was a parking lot. Actually coming up on 3 years ago, it was 2023, there was a huge deluge in July that destroyed the bridge. So we have no way, we have no public way to get people into that site easily. There is a plan to create a footbridge where the road bridge used to be. And I'm hoping, no one wants to resume those tours more than I do, that once we have the footbridge, we can somehow get parking down on the road, which is 519, and resume the tours. So that's the holdup now. There is a longer term plan to get a road bridge farther down the street to that site. That's going to take longer because it has to go through the DOT and all kinds of permits and approvals and so on. So no, unfortunately, I don't have a timeline for that. But
is there a way to see that from the other side?
You can get into the site. Pedestrians are allowed into the site from the upper road, which is called Thomas Carling Drive. So you can go in to see the plane. There used to be tours into the chamber where the turbine is. So you can't get into the turbine, but you can see the plane site.
And you had mentioned that the Morris Canal operated 6 days a week.
Yes.
My assumption would be, since it's for that coal and it's more cargo oriented and business directed. Was that something that right from the get-go, or was there a social reform movement that kind of pulled off, I'm assuming, Sundays as a day of Sabbath?
As far as I know, it was always 6 days. I mean, I think in those days, Sunday was, people didn't work. It was a day of wet rest. And so, to the best of my knowledge, it was always 6 days, and except Sunday, which I think was just more common in those days, that business didn't operate on Sunday. But
It might say a lot about us New Yorkers, where we ran our 7 days a week, and even though people really
did you
wanted it
really?
to be closed on Sundays, they never really did. That must say
Okay.
a lot about New Yorkers.
Yeah. I mean, what would, I don't think there was anything that would keep you from running. The problem with the Morris Canal was there were so many places where you hit a lock or a plane that what would stop you is hitting one that was closed. The problem would be there would be no tender available to bring you through. So, for example, we say the canal ran sunrise to sunset. Well, it's not true. A boat could run through in the dark. What would stop them is coming to a plane or lock that was closed. So there were a couple of long levels, which were stretches without any lock or plane. There was a 17 mile was the longest one, and 11 mile was the second longest. Canal boat captains would plan their trip so they would hit that level right before sunset. Then they could continue running um, as long as they wanted to until they came to a lock or a plane. So I think that was the main thing. It wasn't that, best of my knowledge, it wasn't illegal to boat on a Sunday, but the locks and planes weren't open.
Right, right. I also really like the observation on the photographs. Particularly the mules getting their snack on. That's my personal favorite approach to traveling along a canal, is finding places to eat along the way.
Right.
There's some great places to travel along uh, America's canal system that provide you with an opportunity for refreshments.
Yeah, there was many, many canal stores up and down the canal. In fact, I do one presentation of a stretch of canal in Warren County, and it goes 15 miles, and I'm sorry, not it would be 12 miles, and I count 6 different canal stores along the way.
Nice.
So, the boats did not have refrigeration. They did not have a lot of space for storage. They were picking up provisions on a daily basis. And in addition, the lock and plane tenders would often sell items out of their house because they didn't get paid a lot of money. So they would sell produce, they would sell eggs, they would sell baked goods. So yeah, there were a lot of opportunities to buy things for people, but your mules, you always had mule feed because that was basically like your fuel. Just like in trucker today, he's always got to have gas. The mule feed was the gas that kept your boat going.
Yeah, yeah. Whether it was, Sheets, Wawa, Bucky's, Stewart's,
It
yeah,
is.
7-Eleven. So there's we're bumping into a good time to kind of wrap this up. Anytime there's an opportunity to talk about food, I will. And since it's about my dinner time, I want to say thank you to those that have tuned in. We had a great turnout online. So thank you all for tuning in from parts of New Jersey and New York and other places. I really, really want to appreciate Tim Roth and the entire Canal Society of New Jersey for participating in this program, this wonderful presentation, sharing your history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone who tuned in tonight.